The Arden Bomb Shelter was created, and we don't know, or I don't know the exact year that it was created, but it was created to be the headquarters for all the bomb shelters in the Vegas Valley, and for in case of an attack. If the bomb shelter system had to be activated, the mayors, the county commission, the sheriff, the police chiefs, the fire chiefs, all of that would have gathered at the Arden Bomb Shelter, and they would have coordinated all the efforts from that site. It was set up to handle 27 men and 9 women. I'm not saying anything about the equality there, but that was set up to be, it was far enough away in the 1950s from where they thought the bombs would have hit that it would have survived, and it would have been in touch with all of the other bomb shelters in the valley. And there were quite a few of them. Every one of the properties had a basement room that was set up to be a bomb shelter. It was stocked, in other words. The Flamingo underpass, the Charleston underpass, both had bomb shelters set up. There were basically every abandoned mine that they stocked with non-perishable foods. So it was that there was areas set up all over the valley for people to be able to get to and hopefully survive, for those of us that remember those days. But there had to be somewhere that was the headquarters where everybody would gather who was in charge and would be able to then coordinate what was going on up on the surface. Well, Arden was where there was a cement plant out there. It was they mined gypsum out there, but it was miles away. It was quite a ways out. It was a junction point on the Union Pacific. In fact, that's where they had decided was the closest point that they could connect a railroad to in order to bring supplies to the Hoover Dam site. So that's where the 6 companies and the railroad that went down to the Hoover Dam site came off the railroad out there. So it was quite a ways out. In say the early 1950s, we were probably somewhere around, I'm guessing here, around 20,000, maybe less than that in the valley here. So figure we're 2.3, 2.4 million at this point, 20,000 at that point, you're miles away. And they would have figured that if bombs were being dropped, they would have been dropped on probably Nellis Air Force Base. It had changed to Nellis in 1950. So they would have aimed at that. Even if they had aimed at the airport was still very, very little. So they probably wouldn't even worried about that. They would have aimed at wherever there would have been some possibility of, attacking back. They wouldn't have even aimed at the test site because that was literally only testing. You didn't have nuclear weapons there. There were nuclear weapons at Meadview, out at Lake Mead, which were secretly there and available then to Nellis if they had to be put on airplanes and then take off from Nellis. But they would have aimed at Nellis and Meadview, not at Las Vegas and the little bit that Henderson was at that point. Henderson had only been incorporated in 1953, I think it was. So you're not talking about a heavily populated area here. This was a very small area.
But the threat was, whether it was real or perceived, it was real.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
people felt the real threat that they needed something like this.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I was born in 1954, so I grew up during this time. When I was in grammar school, I had a bracelet that I wore that had my name, it had my address, it had my phone number, it had my blood type on it, you know, everything that was there in case, you know, there was a bomb. Now, I grew up in Orange County, California, but we did duck and cover drills just as they were done here. There were air raid sirens throughout the community. There's one of those that we saved and restored out at the county museum. You can go out and actually see one of the thunderers as the type of air raid siren it is. But this was a very real thing, and on both sides, that sense that could this happen? Absolutely. Did anybody really expect it to happen? I think the interesting thing was, I think among us who were young, we lived with it and didn't really expect it to happen. Our parents did. They had seen the bombs drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They knew what that was. And you know, in the case of my dad, he was in training to go in on the invasion on Japan. He was in underwater demolition in the Navy and had done the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And so he knew what that meant. But when you grow up with it, you just kind of, it's just part of the background of growing up. And so you just kind of accept it. And the first time that I went into the bomb shelter, fallout shelter, was in about 1997, 1996, somewhere back in there. I hadn't been with the museums for too long. At that point, it was part of Parks and Recreation. It was being leased from the school district and being used by Parks and Recreation. They contacted the museum and said, "We've got a bomb shelter here with a bunch of stuff in it. Would you like to look at it?" So I went with some of the other staff and we looked at it and said, yes, we would like to take selected artifacts so that we can, you know, take these and preserve them and have enough pieces that we can talk about the history of what this was. And that's when I got involved with the history of this particular bomb shelter and started doing some research on it, and that because my background is as an historian. I at the time was creating the aviation museum at the airport here. And we took the map that actually showed all of the bomb shelter sites in the valley here. We took examples of the radio equipment. We took examples of the desks and chairs and coveralls and all of that. What we left behind and what people see in that video is actually not from the time period of when it was a bomb shelter. The shelter was used in the 80s and throughout the 80s and even into the late 80s for exercises, not for bomb shelter exercises, but for emergency exercises. The National Guard used it and that sort of thing. So that material is much later. And so we didn't need that. It was not, it didn't reference the period of time that the shelter was built for. So we didn't take that, and it just wasn't apropos to the story that we wanted to document in the history of that site. So there's, you know, they had a lot of uniforms left behind and that sort of thing. And they weren't uniforms with any particular insignia or anything. They were just dungarees and coveralls, that sort of thing. And there was some foodstuffs left behind. They weren't in any shape that you would want to see. There were some cans. We took example cans, but we didn't take all of them because you only need 1 or 2. You don't need 15 of them. It's something where when you're documenting a site, you don't have to empty the site to document it. So the other ones we just left there because they weren't necessary for documenting that site. The difficulty with that site is that it's an extremely toxic site. It's the site itself, what they did when they built that, and it was typical of the time, but they dug a big hole. They used railroad ties, which were soaked with creosote. At that point in time, I've worked with creosote in my life before I was ever in the museum field. Creosote is a wonderful material if you don't want bugs, eating your railroad ties. But they don't eat your railroad ties because it's highly toxic and carcinogenic. So, you can go down there and you smell the creosote. Then they were painted with lead-based paint. So not only do you have a carcinogen that you're breathing in, you also have the standard really ugly green lead-based paint on it. So while there is a sort of sense that it would be wonderful to be able to show people that and walk through it, it would be very difficult to make it safe for people to do it. To make it ADA accessible would be nearly impossible because it was not built to be ADA accessible. Literally, you go down a straight staircase, you hit the bottom, there's a shower head over your head. You're supposed to strip down when you get there and get showered off. You walk down a little alley, a little corridor, very narrow, too narrow for ADA. Not only the fact that you're going down steps, and then you put on these coveralls that are right there in just a cubby. And then you go around a corner and you're in this enclosed space where if you were down there with 36 other people, within a week or two, you'd probably be heading back up on the surface. If you have any claustrophobia, I do, I'd be heading up. It's one of those that it would be very hard to spend a long period of time down there. Plus the fact that if you did, you're setting yourself up for cancer in the future and a lot of other problems. And trying to make this available to the public, because I've worked with a lot of historic structures. Yeah, I'm not sure how you'd be able to do that. There are interesting historic sites. I would almost rather take one of the abandoned mines that are still out there with stocks of food in them and say, this is the kind of thing that we did. This is how we were trying to deal with the idea of bombing.